Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, helping you prepare for the PMP exam. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, where we systematically explain to you the concepts that you'll need in order to feel ready for the PMP exam. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. In this lesson, we review the process of identifying and documenting relationships among project activities. In particular, we define in what order the steps on your project will need to be performed to achieve solid deliverables. For instance, if you're building a house, well, first you must build the foundation, then the walls, and then the roofs. We have a lot to cover, including explaining the mandatory, discretionary, external and internal dependencies, the definitions of lead and lag, describing the difference between projects and operations, and we're also looking at and defining the schedule network diagram. And yes, it's a lot to look at, so we split the lesson into two parts. In the next minutes, you'll get to see an overview and the inputs of the process here in part one. And part one will probably not be all that long. It's relatively easy stuff to get through. Then in part two, there is more meat on the bone. We'll look at the tools and techniques, the outputs, and give you a review as well. But we begin at the beginning with our usual definition of project time management, which is that project time management includes the processes required to manage the timely completion of the project. So project time management is accomplished by defining activities which are sequenced, then given an approximate duration, we assign resources to them, and the result is then a schedule that is executed over the project life cycle. Let's take a look at the processes. The knowledge area has 7 processes, which is more than any other knowledge area from the PMBOK guide. But it begins with planning, with plan, schedule, management. And just like in many of the other planning processes like plan scope management, plan human resources, or plan communications management, we're just going to lay the foundation for the following processes. How are we going to work and execute all the processes here in this knowledge area? So this is the process of establishing the policies, procedures, and documentation for planning, developing, managing, and executing and controlling the project schedule. From here we move on to define activities. That's the process of identifying and documenting the specific actions to be performed so that we can produce the project deliverables. Once we have that, we need to sequence these activities. We need to put them in order in the process of identifying and documenting relationships among the project activities. Now that we have them in a sequence, we can start thinking about, well, who's going to work on these and how long is it going to take? And exactly in that order. Estimate activity resources is the process of estimating the type and quantities of material, human resources, equipment, or supplies that are required to perform each activity. And now that we know that, we can estimate how long it's going to take. In estimate activity durations, the process of estimating the number of work periods needed to complete individual activities with estimated resources. From here, we can finally move on to develop our schedule in the process of analyzing everything that we've done so far. Activity sequences, durations, resource requirements, and schedule constraints to create the project schedule model. And last but not least, let's make sure we keep everything on target in control schedule. The process of monitoring the status of project activities to update project progress and manage changes to the schedule baseline to achieve the plan. And here is our overview in regards to where our processes fall in the process groups. And yes, 6 of our 7 processes are planning processes, and 1 control schedule there at the bottom falls into monitoring and controlling. So we're looking at sequence activities. We're still in planning. Let's take a look at the main concept of this process, and that is, well, you sequence your activities. You put them in order. In define activities, previously you defined what activities you have to perform so that you can deliver the result of your project. But in what order? The process here defines the order. The logical relationships between the activities is what you analyze in our process here. We identified our activities in define activities and in sequence activities. Right now we're going to put them into a logical relationship, into a logical order. Many of the tools used in this process are graphical tools, and PMI loves this chapter. When you look at the commercially available sample tests, you'll always see many questions that deal with sequence activities, so you better know how to apply the tools. Let's take a look at figure 6-7 from the PMBOK guide here and see the overview of the inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs. As you can see, 7 inputs, 3 tools and techniques, and 2 outputs. And interesting enough, there is no schedule, because remember, right now in this process we're only putting things in order. We're sequencing them. We still don't know how long an activity is going to take. We're just going to say activity A comes before activity B, comes before activity C, but we don't know the duration yet. So all that we can produce as an output is a schedule network diagram that shows the relationships in which order these activities are going to have to be performed. Putting some dates to it, that comes later. So we have 3 tools and techniques in this process, but before we can look at these tools and techniques, we have to understand what information we have as the basis for this process before we can look at the tools. So our required inputs, there are 7 of them, are the schedule management plan, the activity list, the activity attributes, the milestone list. Then we'll also be using the project scope statement, and we have enterprise environmental factors and, could you guess? Yes, organizational process assets. Let's go a little bit more into detail here. The first of these 7 inputs, the schedule management plan, comes to us from the plan schedule management process, a sister process here in time management. It is a component of the project management plan that establishes the criteria and the activities for developing, monitoring, and controlling the schedule. Very silly example would be that if you're building a house, then you need to build the foundation first and work on the roof more towards the end. Usually this is evident in the activity list, and the point here to have the schedule management plan as an input is really just to verify that nothing was overlooked. Then the next 3 inputs that we have, they also come from a sister process. They come from define activities, and they are first of all the activity list. This is the complete list of all activities necessary to create our project deliverables. The activity attributes. These are the attributes like the assigned resources, the WBS ID, milestones, leads and lags, and so on. It really contains all the additional characteristics of your activities. Most importantly, it may contain information about required sequencing. And the third one that comes from define activities is the milestones list. This is simply the list of all the significant dates on your project that may be important to know as you sequence your activities. And please do remember that a milestone can be mandatory or optional, and you need to know that for its proper sequencing. The project scope statement comes to us from the process of define scope. It is the description of the project scope, the major deliverables, assumptions, and constraints that we need in order to be able to sequence the activities properly. The next two inputs, they don't actually come to us from any processes. They're more surrounding our project, our organization, and what we do. You guessed it, enterprise environmental factors, and then of course the organizational process assets as well. So when it comes to enterprise environmental factors, these are conditions that are not under the immediate control of the team, that influence, constraints, or direct the project, program, or portfolio when it comes to sequencing our activities. And yes, organizational process assets at the end. You may already have noticed that this is a favorite input and output of the PMBOK guide framework. In essence, every time when your organization may have some policies, procedures, software, methodology, or guidelines that are general to the organization, then we must rely on them. And for this process here, we may have specific methods for scheduling that we need to take into consideration, or there may be lessons learned files from similar projects in the past regarding sequencing of activities. Okay, so the process seems easy to understand, but we have a lot of these documents and inputs that we need for the process. So what if you're blanking and you can't remember them? Can we apply logic to remember them? Sure we can, because as always, we have a plan that we need for most everything. And still, because we're still in the planning process, well, the plan is always a good input to have. We are supposed to sequence our activities. So, well, we need the list of our activities, which we input into our scheduling software. We will also need additional information about our activities. These are the activity attributes. And frankly, I have never seen a schedule without milestones. So there you go with the milestones list. But what again are the other two? Yes, I need the scope statement to ensure that I include everything from the scope. And of course, I need the enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets to make sure that I take any conditions into account and follow proper company procedures. And there you go, you have recreated the 7 inputs with logic. And with that, we have come to the end of part 1 of this lesson. So, Justine, let's say au revoir.
Au revoir.
Until next time.